Welcome to Orensha Tech, and we're here in part 3 of our PowerShell series, and we're going to be going over running commands in this video. Now, running commands is where every PowerShell professional gets started. You can do a lot of crazy things with PowerShell, but it all starts right here with running commands. And before we get into running commands, we're going to go over security and some of the settings that are in place to help protect your computer from the power that PowerShell has. So, should we be worried with such a powerful tool on our computers that is a known threat vector that many malicious actors use to install malicious software on computers? Well, yes and no. Really, PowerShell only gives you the permissions that you already have. So if you can't do it in the GUI, you're not going to be able to do it in PowerShell. It's not a way to bypass the permissions that you already have. So deploying a script that requires an admin and running that as a normal user isn't going to all of a sudden give you those admin privileges. Now, the security that PowerShell offers isn't really designed to stop anyone from running commands. It is designed to stop unintentional running of scripts. And the idea behind that is that it is really easy to trick users into running scripts via phishing emails or any other malicious download that you might find on the internet. So that's where PowerShell puts the prime of its security, is in stopping unintentional running of scripts. Now, the first way that it does that is the execution policy. And the default on Windows 10 and 11 is restricted, which means you cannot run scripts by default on Windows 10 and 11. Now, on Windows servers, it's remote signed. Now, you can always run PowerShell interactively by typing in commands in PowerShell. So this really only applies to scripts. So let's run the command get execution policy. And this is going to show us what the policy is on our computer right now. We can always change this, but this is going to be the current policy. And if you're using the default on Windows 10 or 11, that should be restricted. So I've got mine set to remote signed, which is anything that comes from the internet or that's run from a remote computer has to be signed by a certificate authority. So let's look at another command now. Set execution policy. Before we run that, we're just going to look at the help for this. So we can see right here, set execution policy, and here are all of our options. All signed, bypass, default, remote sign, restricted, undefined, and unrestricted. And we also have a scope, which can be current user, local machine, machine policy, process, or user policy. So we can adjust our execution policy down to granular levels as well. Now, all signed means that all scripts have to be signed by a CA. And that would mean even scripts that you write on your local computer. Bypass essentially is telling PowerShell that you are handling the security. So it's not using any security at all. And this is most common inside of apps that developers are embedding PowerShell into. And they're basically saying to PowerShell, we're going to handle the security inside of our own applications. Now, restricted here is going to be that no scripts are allowed to run, and unrestricted is all scripts are allowed to run, but it does keep some of the underlying security that bypass completely turns off. So to review there, the execution policy is really in place to stop unintentional running of scripts, not to stop any user from opening up PowerShell and starting to type in commands, even copying and pasting entire scripts. It's not really that kind of security. It's using the idea that you are only allowed to do things that you already have permission to do, and it's going to help stop unintentional running of things that people maliciously try to get you to run. Now, Microsoft recommends that you use the remote signed on computers only where you're intending to run scripts, Otherwise, leave it as restricted. Although a lot of PowerShell experts will say that you should leave it on unrestricted because you shouldn't give yourself a false sense of security that this is doing anything. And the idea there is that if a user can come and run code as an administrator on a local machine, you're already in trouble. So putting these policies on PowerShell isn't going to stop a determined malicious actor. Okay, now that we've wrapped up security, let's hop back into running commands. Now this is not scripting, but opening up the terminal here and actually running commands. Now you could always write a script, save it, and then run it, but that's not necessarily the main way to use PowerShell. The main way is to open up your terminal, type in a command, get some objects, get some data, start manipulating the data, figuring out which commands link with other commands. It's really a get your hands dirty kind of tool. And that is until you get good, and then you put something you know and you're sick of typing into a script, and then you can run that script. And another thing about PowerShell, it does have full power of the .NET Core, but that again is not necessarily where you have to start, nor is it where most people even go at all. So let's review the structure of a command. To start off, we have the command itself. We'll take get process as our example. Now the next part is the parameters. So we can see here, IntelliSense autofilled those for us in our box, which is really why you should be using Visual Studio Code if you're following along and haven't installed that yet. Go ahead and hop back to the first part of this series, and we go over how to install this on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So we'll take name as our first parameter, and then we'll come over here and go pwsh for PowerShell, and we'll put in another parameter such as error action. Now parameters can accept a single value, multiple values, or no values at all. And we'll hop back over to our help file to really look at that. So we can see here, get process name accepts an array of strings. So we could always come up here and type in multiple strings here. And if we come down here, we can see that's the same for ID. It takes an array of int32s. And then if we come over to input object, same thing. You can tell by these brackets that it accepts multiple values. And then this include username takes no values. And same with this module. So again, parameters can take multiple values, single values, or no values. And to break that down a little bit more, in between the parameters is a mandatory space here. And it's always prefaced by a dash. And nothing at all is case sensitive by default in PowerShell. And the last thing to wrap up commands is that you really have to slow down to speed up. If you're typing really fast and making a lot of typos, you're going to get a lot of errors. So the best thing is to just slow those fingers down while you're still learning. Type everything out, make sure you have it right, then run it. You're going to save yourself a lot of time by not having to look through so many errors just from misspellings. Okay, let's clear this, and we're going to go over some terminology now. A commandlet is something that's written in the .NET Core language, such as C#. A function is written in PowerShell's own scripting language, and an application is an external executable, including command utilities like ping and ipconfig. So you can actually run ping and ipconfig right within PowerShell. We can see that here. Now back to commandlets, the naming convention is always going to be verb noun. So we can see that with get process or get child item. It's always going to have that same verb noun structure. And if we run the get verb command, then we can see the list of approved verbs inside of PowerShell. And really only about a dozen of these are actually used for the most part, but these are the list of approved ones that PowerShell has given us to stay within that standard PowerShell methodology for commands. As far as the noun portion goes, developers get to make up their own nouns. And the general idea there is to just name it something that calls out which application it belongs to, or if you start writing your own commands, calling out that it's something for your organization or specific to the purpose that you're doing. All right, next we're going to go over aliases. Aliases are just nicknames for commands. For example, if we run GPS here, it's going to be our get process. And if we run help GPS, we can see that get process right there. And you can create your own aliases using the new alias command. So let's look up the help for that. So we've got new alias, the name of our alias, the value of our alias. So if we clear this and run help new alias examples, you can see a few examples of this. So you have new alias, name, list, get child item. So you can take any command and create your own alias, although this is only applicable to the current session, which is where the commands import alias and export alias allow you to take aliases and transfer them between sessions or computers. And just a reminder there, aliases are just for the command name. They do not include any of the parameters. And moving on, we're going to go next to parameter shortcuts. I'm going to clear this. So parameters only need you to type in enough of the parameter name for it to unambiguously call out which parameter that you're trying to get. So if we run get process -in, we're going to get an error that it doesn't know which one. It could be input object, include username, information action. But if we run get process -inc, it's going to know that we're trying to get the include username parameter. So you really only need to type in enough of the parameter name for it to unambiguously call out which one you want. Although, you shouldn't forget about tab completion, especially if you're writing down your commands in a file first. So we hit tab and we can immediately get to it, or if we type in I, we can get to all of the parameters that start with I. So tab completion is a great way to fully call out which parameter you're looking for, so there's no question of what you're going to get in return. Now, parameter aliases do exist, but they're pretty hard to get to and figure out. So we use the example get process error action. And if we were to want to discover a alias for a parameter, then we can always run get command and then our command get process, pipe that into select, expand parameters dot error action dot aliases. So you have to really specifically call out which parameter you want of the command, to find the alias, and most of the time you're not going to find an alias. So it can be nice if you know about them. Otherwise, you can always use the autocomplete or just typing in enough of the parameter to unambiguously call out which one you want. And then the next thing for parameter shortcuts that we're going to look at is positional parameters. So let's look at the help for get process, and we'll find a positional parameter. So we can see right here, name, it's in brackets, which tells us that it is a positional parameter. And we can find the actual position by scrolling down here and finding name right here. And if we go to the position, it's going to call out that that's the first one it's going to look for. So if you run git process pwsh, it knows that it's the name that you're putting in there as the first parameter. So definitely look for those. It's going to be an easy way to save yourself some typing, and it's especially useful when you're using the pipeline to pipe objects from one command into the next without having to specify the parameter. Okay, so let's take our last look at commands. There are a vast array of commands built right into both Windows and Linux and Mac OS. And you can always add more by importing modules that are usually related to specific applications such as Azure or Microsoft 365 admin tools. But you can also use those command line utilities like I was showing earlier. We can run ipconfig right here in the terminal, and it's going to act just like we ran it from in the command line. But PowerShell does offer some better tools, like test connection. So if we run the help on test connection, we can see that this acts and behaves similar to ping, but it gives us a lot more functionality. So while we can always use the command line utilities, there's probably something better that PowerShell has built. And we're going to look at that here by running test connection google.com. But again, we have all of these different options that go above and beyond the regular ping command. And another note, not all of the command line utilities are going to work perfectly inside of PowerShell. And that's because parameters can cause issues in PowerShell's parser. There are ways to get around it, and if you're interested in that, I'm sure there's other videos or learning tools that you can use to figure that out. Otherwise, just look for something that PowerShell has built to accomplish the exact same thing. And then we're going to also look at errors. So there's no doubt when running commands, you're going to run into errors. And it's going to give you a little bit of information. Not all the time is this going to be helpful, but the best way is to go back and break down what you did or run the help on what you did. Okay, that doesn't make sense. And hopefully at this point you see we forgot our dash. And then if we had any other errors, we can come into our help and figure out right away what the expected input structure of this command is. So if you run into any errors, the best thing to do is just hop right back to the help file, review the documentation, look at the examples, and that's going to help you resolve those errors in the quickest way possible. That is it for this part of the PowerShell series, and watch out for our next video where we're going to go over providers, which is a specific type of file structure tool, but it gets into much more than the file system. So watch out for that video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.